Call from the darkness, secrets from the other side revealed. Hook. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, but when you turned around, no one was there? What if I told you there's a place where shadows aren't just shadows, and silence isn't empty? Stay with me till the end, because the dark has secrets, secrets that will follow you long after this video ends. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Inside, the air was still, thick with silence. It felt heavy, like something was waiting. The lights flickered, casting shadows on the walls. A cold draft seeped through the cracks. His breath caught in his throat, sharp and uneven. He stepped forward cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. The floor creaked under his weight, each sound louder than the last. He glanced at the door, half expecting it to swing open. But nothing moved. He hesitated. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. The house was old, the kind that whispered at night. The kind that never let you forget it was alive. He turned the corner, heart hammering. A strange smell lingered in the air, something musty and sour. His eyes darted around the dim room, searching for something, anything. Then he saw it. A figure, standing still by the window. He froze. The figure was wrong. Too still. Too silent. He could hear the creak of the floorboards under his own feet, but the figure didn't move. Not even a twitch. His breath caught again. The temperature dropped even more. Chill air wrapped around him, making his skin tingle. His hand reached for the light switch. He felt the cool metal under his fingers, but the lights didn't flicker back on. The figure still didn't move. He backed away slowly, the room seeming to stretch before him. Every step felt like it took longer than the last. The door behind him seemed so far. And then, the figure's head turned. Slowly. Almost impossibly slow. Their eyes locked. A sudden, piercing chill ran through him. It wasn't a human gaze. It felt like being watched by something older. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. His legs felt like stone. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. He tried to move, but his feet were rooted to the floor. The air grew thick, suffocating. The figure began to move, slowly, purposefully. Its feet slid across the floor, without a sound. Closer. Closer. Every inch of space felt heavier. The door was so far. Too far. His pulse was deafening in his ears. Then, the figure spoke. A voice that was not a voice. It was more of a sensation. A cold, wet pressure on his skin. A whisper, but not one he could hear. Only feel. It pressed in on his mind. The room spun. He couldn't look away. The figure reached out, a finger pointing at him. Everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Heavy. Thick. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, as if something was pressing down on him. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. Panic surged, clawing at his throat. It was too quiet. Too still. He could feel the cold, slick air on his skin, but there was no sound. No wind. No movement. Just the weight of the silence. Then a noise. A soft whisper. Closer now. It came from all around him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The whisper was familiar. It was his name. His heart skipped a beat. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The darkness seemed to thicken. He could almost taste it now, bitter and metallic. Something was wrong. Something was here. A cold touch grazed his arm, sending a jolt of fear through him. He jerked back, but there was nothing there. Just the emptiness. And the whisper. Closer. Again. He could almost hear it now. Soft. Breathing. Come closer. The words felt like they were inside his head. His mind raced. His heart pounded against his ribs. Something was moving in the darkness. A shape. He couldn't make it out. It was large. It loomed in front of him. There was no escape. His legs trembled, but he stood frozen. The whisper became clearer. It wasn't in his mind anymore. It was in his ear. So close. He could feel the breath. Cold, sharp. Don't run. The words were almost a command. He felt his limbs tremble. Fear clawed at his insides. He wanted to scream, to fight, to run. But the darkness held him still. The shape loomed closer. Closer. Its outline twisted, stretching unnaturally. Something about it felt wrong. Then, a cold, clammy hand gripped his shoulder. He spun, eyes wide. But there was nothing there. Only empty air. The pressure in his chest tightened. The whisper returned. Look behind you. He didn't want to. But he had no choice. His head turned slowly, against his will. And then, he saw it. A face. Pale. Ghostly. Staring back at him. Its eyes were wide, unblinking. A dark, hollow gaze that seemed to pierce through him. It wasn't human. The skin was stretched tight over the skull, almost translucent. Lips parted, but no sound came. A whisper of movement from its throat. It wasn't speaking, but he felt it. The words vibrated in his chest, like a cold, distant echo. Why did you come? The room around him seemed to contract, pulling him closer to the thing. Its fingers twitched, as if it were reaching for him. But its body stayed still, frozen in place. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. The chill in the air intensified, wrapping around him like chains. He couldn't move. Couldn't look away. The face was inches from his. He could see the veins beneath its pale skin, pulsing. A faint, sickly scent filled the air, like rotting earth. And then, the eyes blinked. Once. Twice. Slowly. As if savoring the moment. His body tensed, ready to flee. But still, his feet remained frozen. He wanted to scream, to shout, to break free. But the air was too thick, too heavy. The creature's lips curled upward into a smile. A smile that wasn't meant to be comforting. It was sharp. Predatory. Now you're mine, it whispered, its voice like sandpaper on his soul. He felt his heart race, pounding faster, harder. He couldn't breathe. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest. A coldness spread through his limbs, numbness creeping in. His legs gave way. He fell to his knees, gasping for air. But the creature remained. Still watching. Still waiting. The smile never faded. Its hand reached forward again, its fingers stretching toward him, slow and deliberate. It was like the air itself had turned to stone. His body trembled, every inch of him screaming to run. But there was no escape. Not anymore. The creature's fingers brushed his cheek. Cold. Unforgiving. And just as the pressure on his skin intensified, the world went dark again. No sound. No breath. Just emptiness. And then, nothing. The nothingness stretched on, endless and suffocating. He couldn't tell if time was moving. If anything was moving. He tried to open his eyes, but they wouldn't obey. His body felt weightless, as if suspended in air, or submerged under water. A sharp pain flared in his head, but it was distant, far away. It was like waking from a nightmare, but not quite waking. The silence was deafening. Then, a distant sound, faint, like a whisper in the dark. It felt familiar. His name. A voice he recognized, but twisted. It echoed through the blackness, sending a chill crawling up his spine. It was calling him. Closer. Louder. The whisper grew more frantic. He forced his eyes open. A dim, flickering light appeared. He was back. Back in the room. But it was different. The walls seemed to bend and shift, like they were breathing. The air was thick with the same musty, rotting scent. The figure was gone. But the room felt crowded. Like something was waiting in the shadows. He tried to stand, but his legs were weak. He looked down. His hands were trembling, pale and shaking. A low hum filled the air now. Like static. Or something else. Something that made his skin crawl. The walls were too close, the ceiling too low. His throat was dry, tight. The door was there, just a few steps away. But the weight in the room held him in place. A sound, like the shuffle of feet on the floor. He turned. And there, standing at the corner of the room, was a figure. Not the same one. No. This one was different. It was a shape, but a shadow all the same. The edges blurred, never quite clear. A low voice drifted through the air. Faint. Barely a whisper. Not finished. The words chilled him to the core. His heart hammered in his chest. Something inside him screamed to run. But he couldn't move. Not yet. It stepped forward, its form slowly taking shape. An outline of a person, but distorted. Twisted. It moved closer. The hum in the air intensified, crawling under his skin. The figure reached for him, its hand extended. Fingers long and sharp, like claws. Everything around him felt suffocating. The shadows seemed to pulse with life. And then, the whisper. It was all around him now. Join us. The cold fingers brushed against his cheek. The touch was ice. Frozen. Unyielding. It spread through him like poison, creeping deeper with every second. His skin burned where it had touched. But there was no escape. He couldn't move, couldn't even flinch. The figure's eyes gleamed, though he couldn't see them clearly. Only a flash of darkness, pulling him in. The voice came again, softer now, almost gentle. Stay. It wasn't a question. It was a command. His heart thundered in his chest, but his body refused to respond. His hands felt numb, like they weren't his anymore. The air grew heavier. The figure's shape loomed closer, its features sharpening into something wrong. A pale face, with hollow eyes that seemed to watch every twitch of his muscles. The mouth twisted, pulling into a grin that wasn't kind. A grin full of hunger. Full of something else. He wanted to scream, but the words stuck in his throat. The walls were closing in. Pressing. Crushing. His breath came in shallow gasps. The figure leaned in, its face inches from his. A cold whisper brushed his ear, too close, too personal. You've already made the choice. The words sunk into his bones, cold and heavy. He didn't understand. What choice? His legs trembled, and for the first time, he tried to break free. But the figure's hand shot out, grabbing his arm in an iron grip. It yanked him back toward it hard. Pain shot through his shoulder, sharp and sudden. The shadows seemed to gather around him, closing off every escape. He tried to scream again, but his voice was lost in the oppressive air. The figure's hand tightened, pressing his wrist with crushing force. You are ours now. The darkness thickened, surrounding him like a suffocating blanket. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fading in and out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, blending together until he couldn't tell one from the other. And then, with a sudden, jarring clarity, the pressure on his wrist released. He was free. For a moment, he thought it was over. But the world around him had changed. The walls had twisted into grotesque shapes, unnatural and shifting. The floor was no longer solid. He could feel it give beneath his feet. He took a step back, and the shadows surged forward. And then, just as he thought he might fall into the abyss, a voice. A familiar voice. Wake up! It was his name again. This time, it felt real. It felt different. He blinked, fighting against the rising panic, trying to focus. The figure was gone. The room, though dark, felt somehow familiar now. But something was wrong. A lingering sense of dread clung to the air. The hum remained, pulsing, like it was waiting. For him. To make another choice. The voice was still there, distant but clear. Wake up. His eyes snapped open. He was back. Back in his bed. But the feeling didn't fade. The room was silent. Too silent. He blinked, looking around, trying to shake the remnants of the dream. Or whatever it was. The night was still. The air still thick. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. The darkness outside the window seemed deeper now, almost alive. His breath was uneven, chest tight with unease. Something wasn't right. He could still hear it, the hum. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. He turned toward the door, half expecting to see a figure standing in the hallway. But it was empty. Still. His body tensed as he listened. Nothing. He exhaled, trying to calm his racing heart, but something told him it wasn't over. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed darker now, thicker. Like they were moving, shifting. He stood, his legs shaking, unsure. The floor creaked beneath him as he moved toward the door. The hallway outside was quiet. He reached for the handle, but paused. The air felt too heavy, too thick to breathe. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his fingers trembling. What if it's not over? The thought shot through his mind like a jolt of electricity. His heart raced again, his hand retracting from the door. He spun around. The room. It was different. Not in a physical sense, but in a way he couldn't describe. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for him. A shiver ran down his spine as the room seemed to pulse with that same, sickening hum. His skin prickled, every nerve alive with dread. He took a step back. And then he heard it. A soft, distant creak. Something shifting. Something moving. He froze, listening. There was no wind. No reason for the noise. And then a sound. A whisper. His name. It was quiet at first, like a distant call. But it grew louder. Closer. Come closer. It wasn't the same voice from before, but it carried that same chill. That same unnatural pull. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. There, at the foot of the bed, stood a figure. No longer just a shadow. It was the same shape. The same cold presence. But now, it was solid. Defined. And it was looking at him. Asterisk now, asterisk, it said. And everything went still. The room went silent, the air thick with tension. His body went cold. The figure was closer now. Not a shadow anymore. It had form. Substance. It watched him. His mind screamed for him to run, to move, but his feet wouldn't budge. The figure's eyes were dark, empty. A void. A pull. He felt like he was falling into them, dragged by some unseen force. Its lips parted. A faint, breathless whisper escaped. Don't be afraid. But the voice wasn't comforting. It was chilling. Unsettling. It was as if the figure knew exactly what he feared. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears. Could feel the sweat on his palms, the tremble in his legs. Why did you come? It asked. The question hung in the air, thick with menace. He didn't know. Why had he come here? Why had he stayed? His mouth went dry, no words coming. The figure's head tilted, studying him. A sense of inevitability filled the room. The weight of a decision that had already been made. The floor beneath him felt unstable, like it could crack open at any moment. A distant creak, like something shifting, something old, echoed through the room. The walls seemed to close in. He could barely breathe. The figure took a step forward. One slow, deliberate step. Its presence filled the space, pushing him backward. He stumbled, his back pressing against the cold wall. The air felt suffocating. Come closer. The voice now was almost a caress, a pull at his very soul. It wasn't asking. It was demanding. But he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure extended its hand, a long, thin finger pointing at him. The room seemed to warp, the shadows twisting around him. He was trapped. No escape. His body shook as he tried to turn away. But he couldn't. The figure's smile widened. It was too wide. Too sharp. Its hand reached toward him, impossibly fast. The air turned frigid, colder than anything he had ever felt. And just as the cold fingers brushed against his arm, everything went dark. The silence was deafening. He could no longer feel the weight of the figure, the oppressive air, the pressure. It was all gone. But then, a whisper. The same chilling, insistent whisper. Welcome home. And then, the hum returned. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was inside him. A constant, unshakable vibration in his bones. In his blood. The hum echoed inside his skull, vibrating through every nerve. It was as if the sound had become part of him. Part of his very being. His chest felt heavy, suffocating under the weight of it. He tried to move, to break free, but his limbs were sluggish. Slow. His fingers twitched, but nothing more. The darkness around him felt thick, like a tangible thing, pressing in from all sides. There was no light, no warmth, no sound except that haunting hum. It was inside him. Crawling under his skin. His breath was shallow, ragged. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape them. The air grew colder still. He could feel the chill sink deeper into his bones. And then, through the suffocating blackness, something shifted. A shape. A shadow. Moving. It was slow. Methodical. Like it knew he couldn't move, couldn't fight. He tried to scream, to yell for help. But no sound came. The weight in his chest pressed harder. Something was watching him. The shape in the darkness grew clearer, more defined. It was like the figure from before, but this time, it was different. Its body seemed to ripple, distort, like it was both there and not there at the same time. It stepped closer. Closer. The cold seeped into his very soul, making his skin crawl. It stopped in front of him, looming in the darkness. Its eyes empty. Dark. A void. It reached for him. No words. No sound. Just the sound of its cold breath as it leaned in. A sickening chill ran down his spine. And then, just as he thought he might collapse from the cold, the whisper came again. But this time, it was louder. Clearer. Real. Asterisk, you've crossed the line, asterisk. The words echoed through him, vibrating his very core. He wanted to fight. To run. But he was trapped. The figure's touch was cold. Too cold. It wrapped around him like a vice, squeezing the breath out of him. Asterisk, there's no way back. Asterisk. The whisper came again, this time more insistent. More commanding. And then, with a sudden jolt, his eyes snapped open. The room was still. But the hum lingered. A constant presence, now familiar, still pulsing in the back of his mind. He could feel it now. The weight of the choice. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He didn't know where he was anymore. Or what he had become. The room was still, but the air was thick with something he couldn't explain. A presence. A weight. It clung to him, wrapping around his thoughts like a shroud. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had he been dreaming? Had it been real? But the hum. The cold. The whispers? They were still there. In the corners of his mind. In the very air he breathed. He could feel them. Watching. Waiting. He tried to shake it off. To focus on something, anything, to pull himself back to reality. But everything around him felt wrong. The shadows on the walls didn't shift like they should. The light from the window didn't feel real. It flickered like it was struggling to exist. His body felt numb, like he was floating just outside of himself. His heart thudded in his chest, slow and heavy, as if something was tugging at it. He glanced around the room again. Everything was still the same, but it wasn't. There was something off. The silence screamed in his ears. What was happening? He pushed himself off the bed, his feet unsteady. His legs trembled beneath him. The air seemed to pull at him, as though it was resisting his every movement. His hands gripped the edge of the nightstand, grounding himself, but even that felt unnatural. A low, groaning sound echoed through the room. It was the walls. They were breathing. He could hear it now, the faint exhale and inhale, like the house itself was alive. The temperature in the room dropped further. His breath formed small clouds in the air. It was getting colder, colder than it should be. And then he saw it. A figure in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a shape. A shadow. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, it became clearer. The same figure. The same dark eyes. The same twisted smile. It was standing there, watching him. Its presence filled the room, suffocating. He froze. His body went cold again. The figure stepped forward, but it moved differently this time. It didn't walk. It floated. Closer. Closer. The air grew heavier with each inch it came. The hum was louder now, almost deafening. The figure's eyes locked onto his, pulling him in. And then it spoke, its voice like ice scraping over stone. Now you understand. The words felt like a needle in his skull. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. His body betrayed him, locked in place, a prisoner in his own skin. The figure's smile stretched wider. You're ours now, it whispered. And just like that, everything shifted. The room around him bent. Warped. Twisted. The walls seemed to close in. And the last thing he felt before the world spun into blackness was that suffocating pressure in his chest. Like he was being pulled somewhere. Somewhere far away. Far from everything he knew. The darkness swallowed him whole. A deep, endless void. He could no longer feel his body. No longer hear the hum. Only the crushing weight of the blackness pressed in from all sides. His mind screamed for escape, but there was no place to run. No walls, no air, no light. It was as though he had been torn from everything familiar and cast into the unknown. His thoughts scattered, fragmented. And then, suddenly, a sound. A whisper. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a sensation, a pressure against his mind, curling around his thoughts, speaking without words. Asterisk. You're not alone. Asterisk. The words rang through him, felt more than heard. And with that, his senses began to return, slowly. First, a flicker of light. Weak. Faint. He felt something beneath him, cold and solid, but it was foreign. It didn't feel like the floor of his room. His eyes opened, but the light was dim, nothing like the brightness of the room he had been in before. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive presence. He struggled to sit up, but his muscles were weak. His head spun, dizzy from the abrupt shift. He was no longer in his room. The space around him was vast and barren, stretching out into an abyss. A dark landscape, fractured and broken, like an endless nightmare of crumbling stone and twisted shadows. The ground beneath him was jagged, uneven, with cracks running through it as if the earth itself was splitting apart. He felt as though the very ground might give way at any moment, and yet, there was no escape. The air here was colder than before, biting at his skin, making his bones ache. And then, he saw them. Figures. More of them. Standing in the distance. Shadows. Watching him. Waiting. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel their gaze. It was like a pressure. A weight. The same sensation he'd felt before. A whispering voice, like the one that had spoken to him earlier, seeped into his mind once more. Asterisk. Welcome. Asterisk. The word hung in the air, cold and distant. He wanted to scream, to shout, to wake up from this nightmare, but his mouth was dry, his throat tight. The figures began to move, gliding toward him with a slow, deliberate pace. He tried to stand, but his legs were unsteady, and the movement felt unnatural, like he was walking through water. Each step seemed to draw the figures closer, their presence growing more oppressive. The closer they got, the more he could feel it, the cold, the darkness, the emptiness. And then, without warning, a voice. A familiar voice. Asterisk. You made the choice. Asterisk. It echoed in his head, sharp and clear. It wasn't his own voice. It was theirs. The figures. The ones who had been watching. And just as he was about to react, to fight, to scream, one of them reached out. A cold, elongated hand touched his shoulder. And everything went black. The cold touch sent a jolt of fear through him, sharp and unforgiving. But just as quickly as it had come, the darkness enveloped him again. This time, though, it was different. The void was no longer just empty space. It felt alive, breathing. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. The silence was deafening, but he could feel it. Something was waiting. He could feel his heart pounding, but it felt distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. There was no ground beneath him, no walls to press against. Only the oppressive weight of the air. And then, something shifted. He felt a pull, a sudden tug at his chest. A cold, heavy pressure that seemed to drag him down deeper. It felt as though the very darkness itself was consuming him, swallowing him whole. His breath became shallow, tight. He wanted to scream, but the air had thickened, pressing against his throat. Something was coming. Something was getting closer. A figure appeared before him, one that he couldn't quite make out at first. It was shapeless, formless, a silhouette. But it was there. And then a voice. A low, guttural whisper. Not in his ears, but inside his mind. Asterisk. Do you feel it now? Asterisk. He froze. The words had no warmth, no compassion. Just cold. Empty. As if they had been spoken from the depths of this blackened abyss. The figure moved closer, but there was no sound. No footsteps. Just the weight of its presence. And then he saw it, its eyes. Black pits. Hollow, infinite. They locked onto his, and he could feel something shift within him. A deep, gnawing sensation. Like something was reaching into his chest, pulling, twisting. Asterisk. You belong to us now. Asterisk. The voice came again, clearer this time, resonating deep within him. It wasn't just a statement. It was a claim. He tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't respond. He couldn't move. It was like he was frozen in place, stuck in a world that wasn't his. The figure reached out. Its fingers were long, unnaturally long, and they were cold. So cold. He couldn't feel his own hands, couldn't feel anything except the deep ache inside him. The figure's touch was upon him. It was like ice sinking into his soul, pulling at every fiber of his being. Asterisk. Now you are ours. Asterisk. The darkness grew darker. The world twisted and folded in on itself, and then, everything stopped. Complete stillness. His chest was tight. His breath shallow. He could no longer tell if he was awake, or if he had ever been awake at all. The hum. The whispers. The cold. They were inside him now. And there was no escape. The stillness stretched on, suffocating, as though time itself had come to a halt. His thoughts were sluggish, drowning in the weight of what he felt, and didn't feel. The emptiness had become a part of him now. It was inside him, clinging to his very essence. He could hear his heart, but it felt distant, like it was beating for someone else. The silence was deafening, yet filled with an eerie hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones. He tried to focus, tried to claw his way back to reality, but there was nothing to hold on to. The shadows around him were moving again, swirling in patterns too chaotic to follow. Something was shifting, something was changing. The coldness intensified. It seemed to seep deeper, like it was rooted in the very air, seeping into his skin. He could still feel the weight of the figure's touch on him, lingering, as though its fingers had left an imprint on his very soul. His body felt heavy, too heavy to move. His chest ached as if the very act of breathing was an effort. And then, something changed. The hum in his head grew louder, sharper. It was no longer a soft vibration, but a ringing, relentless noise that shook him to his core. His thoughts scattered, one after another, as though something was pulling them away. And then a voice. Not from outside, but inside him. Asterisk. You are not alone. Asterisk. The words repeated, over and over, each time louder, more insistent. He tried to scream, but his mouth was sealed shut, his voice trapped in the void. A sharp pain stabbed through his mind, making him gasp. Asterisk. Do you understand now? Asterisk. The voice twisted, like it was mocking him. His head throbbed with the force of it, every word like a hammer driving deeper into his skull. The darkness pressed closer, pulling at him from all sides, threatening to crush him. And then a flash. A blinding light, like a crack in the blackness. For a moment, there was nothing. No hum. No whispers. No cold. Just pure, searing light. His eyes, still adjusting, couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. It was a room, no, a place, familiar but wrong. The walls, smooth and sleek, like glass, stretching infinitely in all directions. The floor beneath him was a strange material, soft yet unyielding. It pulsed like it was alive. His breath caught in his throat. He was no longer alone. Figures were there, everywhere. Shifting in and out of the light. Watching him. Staring with those same hollow eyes. Their presence was suffocating. Overwhelming. And in the center of the room, the figure from before stood. Its form was clearer now, solid, unmistakable. It was smiling. Not with warmth. But with cold satisfaction. Asterisk. You were always meant to be here. Asterisk. The words felt like ice seeping into his veins. Asterisk. Now there's no turning back. Asterisk. The room closed in, and the light began to fade. The whispers returned. Asterisk. Welcome to your new home. Asterisk. And just like that, he felt the ground beneath him disappear. And everything went black. The void swallowed him once again, deeper than before. But this time, it wasn't empty. The darkness hummed, a low, rhythmic pulse that filled his ears, vibrating through his bones. It was different, alive. He could feel it. He could hear it now, voices. Soft. Echoing. They weren't human. They were something else. Something older, deeper. His chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, swirling around him, filling his mind. They spoke in fragments. In pieces. Welcome. Home. Join us. The words scraped against his thoughts, like nails on glass. He wanted to scream, to shout, to escape. But his voice was gone. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The coldness surrounded him once more, sharp and unforgiving. He tried to look around, but there was nothing, just an endless, suffocating black. And then, a figure emerged from the nothingness. At first, it was just a shape. A silhouette. Unclear, like a shadow in the dark. But as it moved closer, it solidified, becoming more real. The figure was tall, thin, unnaturally so. Its skin was pale, stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes, wide and dark, seemed to reflect nothing but the emptiness around them. It was smiling. But not in any way that was comforting. Its mouth was too wide, the grin too sharp. Do you understand now? The figure whispered. The voice was cold, like the air itself had been hollowed out. You are one of us. The words sank into him, deep, twisting inside his chest like an icy hand. His heart pounded erratically, but it didn't feel like his heart anymore. It was wrong. Foreign. The figure stepped closer, its eyes gleaming with that hollow hunger. He wanted to back away, but his feet wouldn't obey. The weight of the presence pressed down on him, like it was pulling him into the very ground. Join us, it repeated, more insistent this time. He tried to close his eyes, to block it out. But he couldn't. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, drowning out everything else. Join us. The figure's cold hand reached out toward him, its fingers impossibly long, its touch electric. And then he felt it. The warmth. A heat rising from within him, spreading through his chest, his veins. Not the warmth of life, but the warmth of something else. Something ancient. Something he couldn't understand. He could feel it now, the pull. The need. The desire. The figure was drawing him in. It was too late to resist. He felt it in his very bones. Yes, the figure whispered, just as his world began to crumble away. And then, everything collapsed. And he was nothing. Nowhere. Lost. The void was suffocating. There was no ground beneath him, no sky above. Only darkness, thick and oppressive, pressing in from all directions. But now, it felt different. It wasn't the silence he had felt before. This time, there was something else, something waiting. He could hear it, a faint sound. A whispering. It wasn't words, not exactly. But it carried an undeniable pull. Asterisk. You're still here. Asterisk. The voice didn't belong to him, or to any living thing he knew. It was cold. Ancient. And yet it felt familiar. He could feel the ground beneath him shift, something warm beginning to spread through the cold. A presence, just out of reach. It wasn't a body, it wasn't even human. A sensation, more than anything. A touch. Something watching him. Slowly he began to stir. His body felt heavier than before, as if something had settled deep into his chest. The whispering continued louder now. Asterisk. You never truly left. Asterisk. He tried to open his eyes, but the darkness was absolute. It was as if his eyelids were weighted, locked in place. Asterisk. You belong here now. Asterisk. The words wrapped around his mind like chains. They squeezed tighter with every beat of his heart. The temperature began to drop again. A chill sunk into his bones, heavier this time, more real. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound caught in his throat, thick and suffocating. And then he felt it. Cold fingers brushing his skin. Long, thin. Almost inhuman. They wrapped around his arm, pulling him closer. His body resisted, but his muscles were weak, as though they had been drained of all strength. The presence was here, tangible now. More than just a voice or a sensation. It was touching him. Closer. Pressing. And then, he could hear it. The hum. Louder. Like the beating of 1,000 hearts. Pulsing through the air. Asterisk. You've always known, haven't you? Asterisk. The voice was almost gentle now. A soft caress, but still that cold, merciless tone. He wanted to pull away, to break free, but there was no escape. The air itself held him captive. And then, just as his last shred of hope began to fade, a new presence stirred. A warmth. A spark. A single thought, growing clearer in his mind. Asterisk. This isn't the end. Asterisk. The darkness quivered as if the room, the very void around him, had taken a breath. And then, the weight lifted. For the briefest moment. Just enough for him to realize one thing. It wasn't over. Not yet. The darkness shifted. And then, the ground began to crack. The ground cracked beneath him, splintering like glass, sending jagged shards of darkness into the void. The air thickened, pulling him downward, but this time, something else shifted. A presence, stronger, clearer, began to rise from the depths of the abyss, as if the very fabric of reality was being rewritten. He could feel it. A pull in his chest, warm and intense, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long night. It was his breath again. His heartbeat. His body. For the first time, he could move. His fingers twitched. His legs stirred beneath him. The darkness trembled. This is not your place. A voice whispered, quieter now, as though it were fading. Asterisk. You were never meant to stay. Asterisk. The pull grew stronger. It wasn't the cold grasp of the figures anymore, not their unyielding, icy fingers, but something softer. Something that promised release. And in that moment, a flood of memories rushed through him. The weight of the shadows. The oppressive whispers. The figures. But also the warmth of sunlight. The sound of his own breath. The feeling of grass beneath his feet, of the world outside this prison. The pull wasn't from the darkness, it was from life. And with a final, sharp breath, he broke free. The world around him cracked open, not in destruction, but in freedom. The dark walls dissolved into thin air, crumbling into nothing. For the first time, he saw light, real, pure light. A gentle glow, soft and comforting, like the first rays of morning. It flooded everything, pushing the darkness back, piece by piece. He blinked, disoriented, but the sensation of his own breath filled his chest, strong and steady. And then, he saw it. A doorway, shimmering with warmth. A passageway that led beyond this place, into a world unknown but filled with possibility. He took a step toward it, his legs still weak but moving forward, one foot in front of the other. The darkness was behind him now. Fading. The figures? Gone. He was free. As he crossed the threshold, the door closed behind him, softly. And in that silence, the echoes of the abyss faded away. The hum? Gone. The whispers? Silent. It was over. For now.